Okay. I remember. Okay, let me make sure I've got the handouts here. Okay, so Carl, if I could get you to read the first 8 verses again of Revelation chapter 6. Okay, listen up.
I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make men slay each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a day's wages, and 3 quarts of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine." Then the Lamb opened the 4th seal, and I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a 4th of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth.
Okay, very good. So everything between chapters 6 and 19 discuss troubled times. Okay. So the question is, when are these troubled times? And on the handout, I've got 2 views on there, but we'll get there later. Because it talks about in Matthew 24, and we'll probably talk about this next week. It's the Olivet Discourse, but he talks about the end of the age. Okay, and versus what are the end of the age versus the end times? Because we think of the end times of being sometime in the future, that one day, probably even after we're all dead, all things will come to an end. So the question is that what he's talking about here? Okay. And my view is, and I've said this before, my view is that he's talking about the end of the age, the end of the old covenant age that came within the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Okay. And in Matthew 24, we'll see. We'll do that next week when we get to those latter half verses. That he says this generation will not pass away until all these things happen. He's talking to those people, right there. If I said to you, whatever I predict, that I will win the lottery, and this will all come about before this generation disappears, because I'd be a part of that. So anyway, so that's it. So I've got in your notes there at the top, it says a vision of the 4 horsemen that represents different aspects of the end times, whichever end times those are. These horsemen are commonly referred to as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And there's got the description. So you've got the picture here, which has the different colors, some description about the rider or the event, and what's taking place. I think that I had mentioned, remember last week we had the meeting, and I just did a short thing about Jesus' ascension into heaven. But I think what we see is that I don't think that even though it says and the fourth and the third horseman and the creature said that one of the four living creatures said, come, and then the fourth one he said, come. I don't know that they're a successive thing. I think it's just these are four things that just come with war. You know, they come with pestilence, they come with famine, and they come with death. I think those are the four horses. We can look at this right now in Gaza. I mean, regardless of what people say, Gaza was a thriving country. I'm not even about not probably not thriving like we're thriving, but they were normal. I mean, they went to restaurants, they did this and that. War comes, you don't even have to get into the motivation or the reason why. War comes, and what do you see? You see the destruction of war. You see the famine. You see the pestilence, the sickness. You see death. How many people have been, but see, it all came in one event. It may not have been one day. It was war, and I think that's who that first horse, who that first horseman is that he's bringing the war. What did it say? So conquering, the red one takes peace away from the earth, the black one's the famine, and then the pale horse is death. So that sound okay? I mean, yeah. A lot of times we just read stuff like that and we get confused by it. We just read over it here, figure God's doing something. Ray?
Yeah, I got a question, and I'm not sure how to really word it. If Revelation is supposed to be a vision that John is having, and the vision is symbolic, how does this bring about the revelation of Jesus Christ? How are we supposed to interpret the vision and then the symbolism behind it, and that in conclusion it is talking about Jesus Christ?
You have to go back to several weeks ago when I said, and I know you have, but I said everybody needs to read the whole book of Revelation. A couple of times. I mean, you need to read the whole thing so you pick up the whole story. See, when we pick apart piece by piece, week by week, it doesn't bode well. I would imagine that if churches got this letter or any letter in the scripture, is that they may have gathered and they may have stayed. The average book in the Bible or in the New Testament, okay, there's 27 books. I think there's 229 chapters, something like that in the so what is that? 10 chapters is the average. So if the pastor stood up and said, look, we got a letter from Paul, we got a letter from John, we got a letter from whoever, Peter, get a letter from the first John, you're pretty short there, No, we've got a letter. Let me read you the letter. This is my interpretation is that they would stand and they'd read the whole letter to them. And then just like I do, you look and you see people's expressions and stuff like that. You see when they're confused or if they want to raise their hand or, something like that. And then you discuss it. Now, maybe they sit down, 10 chapters would probably take, I don't know, maybe 30 minutes to read, if you're reading at a regular, cadence. And then if you had an hour of discussion, a question answer period, but people would walk away and you fully understand that some of this stuff's hard. But they would understand or they'd have their questions answered or whatever. Maybe they'd stay there 4 or 5 hours. Maybe they'd talk about it during the week. I've been in churches before were the midweek Bible studies or the midweek small group studies were based around the pastor's sermon on Sunday. So you had the pastor, do a sermon, and then in the small house groups or the small groups, people would discuss what they heard from the sermon. So so it's not just a one shot out the door. People are discussing. So anyway, back to Ray. So your question is pretty hard because to give answers, I'd have to go into parts of Revelation, say that we haven't covered, or parts of Revelation that we covered, 8, 9 weeks ago. All we know is it says that it is a revelation of Jesus Christ. That is a revealing of Christ, and it's a revealing by Jesus. And so when we get into, now you got to remember, at this time period, Jesus is in the throne room. Okay, last week I talked about if we imagine the ascension and Jesus left the earth and went up through the clouds. Those look like clouds, don't they? And he went through the clouds and he ends up in the throne room with God the Father, and he takes the scroll. Now we're going to see something about Jesus, because Jesus is the one who's in control of the scroll. He's in charge of the judgment. All of it. And we're going to see when we get down to, I forget which verse. I don't know if it's in 17, in chapter 6. It says there, it's the judgment of the Lamb. That all this, the judgment of the Lamb. You don't expect that from Jesus. You don't expect that from a lamb, maybe from the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Did you see it there, Carl? Do you see it there? I saw you looking. I didn't know if you saw that, what it said. Well, anyway, it's down there. It's in the judgment. It says that it's from Jesus. So Ray, you can see, so he's a judge. That we see elsewhere where Jesus says, the Father has given all authority to me. Another place where it says that the Father doesn't do the judging, Jesus does the. So you got to kind of put this all together. You got to read the whole book. You got to be able to mix. That's why I said I want to go into next week about Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, because I think Jesus, what we see here in chapter 6 is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. Pastor, are you going to say something?
I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. You have to look at it in the bigger context. But even if you said, even the Bible is a revelation of God's love for sinners in Jesus, and you just can't pick and choose a couple of chapters of something and say, well, that doesn't really sound like any Jesus stuff to me. But when you see the bigger picture, and then John's vision, he's referring to things, as you've been pointing out, like Ezekiel, Daniel, Zechariah, and it's tying in other things together. God's total revelation, so to speak.
And the thing is we think, well, these guys were Bible scholars, and they weren't. They couldn't even. Most of the population couldn't read, let alone have their own Bible. Where'd they get their own Bible? It's, maybe a lot of these New Testament churches had some books of the Bible, some of the scrolls. Nobody had the whole thing. The Apostle Paul never read the book of Revelation. Wasn't written yet before he was executed. James was killed early on. I doubt if any of them, except for John, read the book of Revelation. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I'm just saying that you gotta be in it, and you gotta know. And like Pastor said, almost all of this stuff comes out of Ezekiel, and Daniel, and Isaiah. But these people knew it, even though they never touched the Bible. They knew it because of the oral traditions and the oral teaching. Imagine if on Sunday, pastor said, look, I just thought we ought to today read the book of Revelation the whole way through. We'll take a break to go to the bathroom. You come back in and let's discuss it for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. We'll do question and answer. We'd all be gone. It's a bye week for the Cardinals this week, so I mean, nobody's got to get home for the football game. So yeah, Joe.
Yeah, I think we tend to forget that the environment in which John had to write this. Like, he was in exile in Patmos, and he had to write it in such a manner that his Roman captors wouldn't destroy it. They basically thought he was crazy. So that's part of the reason why you see it in the method in which he wrote it down.
It could be. I mean, I've heard that before. That say, "Oh, it was a secret so that the Romans couldn't figure it out." I bet he could have given a straightforward message, and the Romans couldn't figure it out. No, seriously. I mean, just their mind wasn't there. They think it's all a bunch of hooey anyway. They just want we do this today. You can believe what you want, just don't disturb the government.
But that was the point. See, they didn't want his stuff getting out if they thought it was inciting.
Right.
Okay.
You're right. If he was saying, yeah, the beast is Nero, that might cause troubles. Anyway, did that help at all, Ray? I know it probably didn't, but
I just digger. But I understand. I've read Revelation a couple of times. That's what I used to do when I was on the way to work and everything. That I probably read Revelation probably about maybe 80 times. And I understand. It's just what I see. What I see happening is oftentimes, okay, well, what I see happen is oftentimes that even in reading this particular part of it and everything else, that we want to put into a worldview or a secular view to it. Like the tribulation. Well, it's going on right now. Look, there's a war going on in Pakistan, or there's a war going on. It may not even have anything to do with it.
I can tell you it doesn't have anything to do with it. He's talking about what people talk about end times and they get into, and every time something flares up, especially in the Middle East, it's the end of the world. This is chapter so-and-so of this book or something like that. And I can tell you the only thing that it would probably relate to is where Jesus said, and this will be in the Olivet Discourse, we'll talk about next week, is when he says you'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. You've always got wars and rumors of wars forever, because he says this, he goes through all the things. This is really funny. He goes through all the things that people who look to the last days for everything that, they read the newspaper and the Bible together. And everything they look at is, oh, look at this. This is happening. This is happening. Jesus in the Olivet Discourse goes through, you'll see this, you'll see this, you'll see this. But he says, and he says it in the red letters even, he says, but these are only birth pains. This is not the end. How much more clear can you be? You're going to see these things, and they're going to be disturbing, but it's not the end. And people today, they read it and they go, this is the end, Like that. And it's like, well, how do they do that? I shouldn't say it that way, because I used to do that. I mean, that was my MO when I was in a different
well, even church. Jesus said that he didn't know the day, the time, that only God knew that.
Right. That only the Father knew. No, he knows that now, though. I mean, see, that's the thing. In his humanness, in his human nature, he didn't know. But in his divine nature, he would know. So, well, in fact, that's even in the Olivet Discourse too. Interesting chapter it is. So we discussed the Whitehorse a couple of weeks ago. Oh, you know what I had here? Yeah. So all of this tribulation and stuff that happens, this is where I want to narrow this back down to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. Because remember a couple of weeks ago, I brought that big book from Josephus in, and I was reading about the terror he brought on the Galilee region. What was the guy's name? Started with a V, I thought. I don't remember. But anyway, so he did. I've got this here. This again from Josephus. This time I didn't bring the whole book. I just retyped it and put it in my notes. It says, historian Flavius Josephus tells the story of the run-up to the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, now this is in surrounding areas and everywhere. You got to remember, Jerusalem and Israel, you know, they're made up of different cultures of people. You got Roman people, you got the Jewish people, you got like that. And what do people do when times get tough? Do they join together or do they turn on each other? They turn on each other. So this is what Josephus is saying. He says every city was divided into two armies and camped against one another. Okay. It says, and the preservation of one party was in the destruction of the other. Remember, this is Josephus writing like in 100 AD. Okay, like 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. He goes, so the daytime was spent in the shedding of blood, in the night in fear. It was then common to see cities filled with dead bodies still lying unburied, and those of old men mixed with infants, all dead and scattered about together. You know, I mean, this is pretty gruesome, you know, kind of stuff that he's talking about. Whoops. Oh, wrong door. Well, you can come in and go right through there. I got no. You can stay for our Bible study too. Anyway, so he continued. He goes, women also lay amongst them without any covering for their nakedness. You might then see the whole province full of inexpressible calamities, while dread of still more barbarous practices which were threatened was everywhere greater than what had already been perpetrated. So he's saying, he goes, not only is it bad, there's more coming. I mean, he's saying it from a historical point of view. What I just described, after that even came more stuff, because he's talking sometimes, he's not talking about in his time still coming. I mean, you know, to read Josephus and the Jewish wars, I mean, really becomes fascinating, because that's probably as close as we have to somebody writing about that time. So when Jesus is speaking, or the scriptures speaking of all of these bad things happening, see, people today want to say, well, those bad things didn't happen back then. I mean, but when he's talking about, and we'll get to this later, is the stars falling out of the sky and the sun darkening and stuff like that. To those people that were going through that, that's exactly what it was like, you know, for them, you know. So anyway, so if you ever want to, I think you can even get it online. You can even get it in what's it called, LibriVox, you know, where they'll read it to you, you know, which is a free thing. Now he's got two things. He's got, you know, the Jewish wars, what covers that time from 66 to like 70, 71 through the destruction of, you know, Israel. But he's also got the antiquities of the Jews, and he goes back through all of Jewish history. You know, I mean, as a historian, you know, he goes, you know, he's not going through as a Bible guy or anything like that. He's doing it as a historian, just to, you know, the history of the Jews. So it says when he opened the second seal,
Hey,
who said, Dave, go. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the stars falling out. Where was that scripture again? The stars falling out of the sky.
Well, it's gonna be at the end of this chapter. and it's in Matthew 24.
Okay.
It's in Isaiah, it's in Ezekiel. I've got a whole list of words, all of
He's
this.
going next week.
See, John's not just making this up. How would I describe this kind of tragedy? It just comes top of mind, and he could just pick out all the other Old Testament prophets who spoke in the same language, using this, sun darkening, the moon turning to blood, the stars falling from the skies, earthquakes, all this. I mean, you just go boom, boom, boom. I'll bring that next week. I'll send you that, Dave.
Hey, Gene,
Yeah.
okay, also, that's almost like the material came out of nowhere, but it came from somewhere to create this. So now it's going back to where it came from. I know, I know that's science fiction, but
I've got another paper, and I don't think I brought it. I think I took it out of my folder just this morning when I was cleaning up from previous. Hang on, I'm looking. What does that say? No, I took it out, but I talked about the deconstruction of the universe. Yeah, because that's what it sounds like. That's what you're talking about, Dave. It's almost like God's deconstructing the universe to make it new. So, okay, where were we?
material went back to where it came from. The material went back to where it came from.
Yeah, which was nothing. Anyway, so when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come." Too bad Pastor Roger's not here. He's not here. I don't see him. Because he talked about this last week, or a couple of weeks ago, because I said it's come, like he's calling out the horsemen. And Roger brought up that in the King James, it says, "Come and see," like he's talking to John. Like, come and see what I'm doing. So I looked up the wording, in there, and it's the family of translations that come out of the King James, where it says "come and see." Okay, well, why they chose that, we don't. All the other modern translations just say "come," or them being told to go, to where it's more clear which way that they're, or which way they're speaking. R.C.H. Lenski, that's how you know when it's a good Lutheran scholar, is when they've got 3 initials before the last name. They do, they all do. But anyway, in his commentary, he says, "Be going." He does his own translation in his commentary, okay? So, I mean, it's not like he comes up with a whole different story, but he tries to use the words where they'll be better understood. But he says, "Be going," or "be on the way." So he's calling out to the horsemen, "Be going," like that. So, but it means the same thing. It's just a matter of, and then if I looked it up, I didn't, I'm sure that I looked in my Mounts. My Mounts is, Robert Mounts he does the Greek, he does the Greek interlinear. So you look up the verse, hit the button on your Bible Gateway to all the translations, you find Mounts, you hit Mounts, and it gives the interlinear with the Greek and the English. You click on it and it gives you the Strong's number and how it's used, what it means, how it's used, and how it's used in various different passages if it's used more than one way. But I didn't write that down. So let's see. Anyway, verse 4, he says, "And out came another horse, bright red." Put your picture, right? Bright red. It says he takes peace from the earth. This is funny because it causes people to kill each other. And that's kind of like what we were reading about in, Josephus, when he was talking about what was happening in the towns. So You know, and this isn't only just a last days thing or a revelation thing, John said in First John, he said in chapter 3, he says, this is John, First John in scripture, we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. We all know that story. And why did he murder him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. So if you ever wonder why Cain killed Abel, find it in First John, like that. But he's just saying that strife that we have amongst ourselves, that's what's been brought about by this. But so that we don't miss this, who is sending these people out? Who's sending these horsemen out to cause this calamity? Yeah, Jesus. So anyway, let's see, verse 5, he says, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, come, or be going, or whatever. Yeah. And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in its hands. What would scales say? Pardon?
Justice.
Well, it could be that. It's weights and measures, because it's going to talk about famine. And if you have to be measuring your food out, you have to be rationing, things are probably getting pretty bad. And then what happens to pricing? When you have to ration, the prices go up. And so then you can't afford what you used to afford. He says in verse 6, he says, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil or the wine. So, the best you can figure out is you used to get a lot more than what you can get here. So maybe you get, maybe at one time you got 12 quarts for a denarius. Yeah, I mean, we can see that with pricing. Remember when eggs really shot up? For whatever reason, they shot up. Okay, used to be you got a dozen eggs for $3.50. Then all of a sudden you were paying like $7.50, $8 for the same dozen eggs. And so the cause of that versus the cause of what's happening here may be different. But I'm just using that as an example. So what they're saying is we're in famine times or shortage times or whatever it is. So now it's 12 eggs for $8.50. And you go back and go, oh, remember we used to do $3.50. So better watch the time here. He says, when he opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. Now here's the thing, is to note that each creature is different, because he said, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature. So each one of the, remember, we got the 4 living creatures that we saw in Revelation 4, seated around the throne, and it gave descriptions of them. One was like an ox, one had the face of a man, one had, I don't know if it was a lion or, whatever, I don't remember what it was. But so what you've got is each time you got a different creature calling out, one of these horsemen. And he says, come. And I look and behold a pale horse. That what color we got on the chart here? And I can't even find my chart. Huh? Cream? Oh, okay. Okay. I kind of I don't know. I'd have to ask a girl what color that is. Pale gray. Anyway. Well, that's saying something. Okay, so now I've got it as a note here, and I don't know where I picked this up from. But it said, look, I saw a pale horse, and the rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. So this is the only writer who's got a name. His name's Death, you know, and Hades followed him. Okay, but I've got a note here. It says that the color was a pale green horse. So the pale horse green. So the color of a corpse. I haven't looked at too many corpses that I don't know. Like I said, I don't remember. You know, some of my notes are ancient from when I've taught the classes before. But it's unhealthy looking, probably from the famine. Now it's a name you don't see in baby books. Death and Hades. Hey, look, I'm gonna name this one. I'm gonna name this one Death and Hades. You know, yeah, you don't get that. Oops. Anyway, so I just think that, you know, all of this is just kind of a perfect storm of catastrophes, you know, prophesied by Ezekiel. You see the exact same language here. In fact, in Zechariah, it even uses horses. Those horses have chariots, but they're calling down judgment, you know, as they're released and all. So again, like I say, all this stuff is just, you know, recycled, recycled language to make a point. Each writer may be talking about something else, but what they're doing is using the same language to call down that type of judgment or on that type of people. But each time it's kind of devastating. Now, if we go back and we say that this is this end of the age is the end of the old covenant, you know, and just because people didn't go willingly, the Jews didn't go willingly, you know, when Jesus was bringing this new covenant in. In fact, he ended up on a cross, you know, over it. So, but you know, you look at the time that, you know, that God has called down judgment on his people. Happened in the garden. Kicked them out of the garden. Happened in the flood. You know, I mean, those were his people, even though they didn't want to be his, didn't want to be his people. When he used Assyria to take away the 10 northern tribes, you know, you talk about devastation. They never came back. You know, who knows where they ended up? You know, when he took the southern tribes into Babylon, you know, destroyed the temple and, you know, did all. So you see that this stuff, you know, happens. And this is why I think that his judgment here is against his people. This isn't the judgment that'll come later, maybe to the nations and that, but I think it's to his people. It's the Lamb calling out this, you know, this judgment. So how close are we on time?
Hey, Gene.
Yeah.
Gene.
Right.
The thing that I see in reading this, it kind of draws you to the conclusion or possibly thought, and that it is a destruction, but actually it's a restoration.
Give me
God is going to restore what he originally established.
Well, that's what we see. That's what we see at the end, where you go from chapter 19, but then you've got the new heaven and the new earth, you know, the new heaven and the new earth, and that he will restore all things, you know. So let me see.
But the restoration started the day after the fall, didn't it?
I guess. I mean, I don't know. What's that?
He that is being born is dying.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, okay, so that's the four horsemen. So next week we'll get into the fifth seal and the sixth seal, and we'll talk about Matthew 24, because that's where we're going to see what I think is describing Matthew 24, the first, I don't know, 35, 36 verses in there. I think they're describing what's happening in Revelation with the fifth and the sixth seals.
Mhm.
Anyway, if I can give you any words of encouragement, read the book of Revelation this week. I mean, I know that, we get home and we forget, we get, busy doing stuff. But in a week, I mean, it's 22 chapters. You got 7 days. That's 3 chapters a day. You got to read something, right? Like that. I mean, you got to read something. So, any questions? Anybody else online have questions? Dave, I'll send you that listing of stuff that I have on where all of that stuff about the moon and stars and this and that come from the Old Testament. That way you can
Okay,
look at it.
great. Thank you.
You can curl up in bed with Lida and read it to her.
Gene?
Who Gene?
Skip.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I was thinking more about Ray's question about where do we see Jesus in here? And, if I met someone that was curious about the Christian faith, I wouldn't give them the Bible and say, read the back to see how it ends and start there in the book of, because some people do that with a novel, I want to know the ending. But when you started out, you brought out that this book is written for believers to comfort them in times of trial and persecution. So it has its place, and God could use someone reading the book of Revelation to come to saving faith because his word is living and active. Right. But this isn't the book that I would have people start with.
Right.
But it's here to say, yeah, you're going to face really bad stuff as believers. But then when you get further along and we see Jesus on a white horse later, chapter 19, then you see, oh yeah, Jesus, and Ray's comment about restoring everything. And so this is to give us hope and encouragement.
Yeah. Well, one thing just so is that I can make a case that it's not saying that the believers are going to have a hard time. They're going to be collateral damage, in it all. But we'll see in Matthew 24. I mean, that's why I think it's such a key. Is Matthew 24 tells the believers what to do when they see all of this coming. What did he say? Flee to the hills. Right. Like that. Yeah, get out of Dodge. I get. And the believers listened, and the non-believers, didn't. Like that. But that doesn't mean we won't be collateral damage, in all of this. But see, Jesus told people, because that's why I think he's talking to those people, and he's saying, when you see these things happening, get out. Okay. See, I don't think it can be for today, because he also says, and hope that it doesn't happen on the Sabbath day. Who in this room cares about the Sabbath day? We go to football games on the Sabbath day. So traveling to get out of town to save our lives would be no problem. To a Jew, that'd be a big issue. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that next week. We are now going to sing along. I'm turning off the recording, but you guys can all stay. Troy went away. Let me see. It's not good.